Howdy folks, welcome back to Trump and Media. We're going to cover a few things today, including masks, whether or not this virus is a seasonal virus and what that means exactly, and we're going to touch a little bit on hydroxychloroquine. So strap in, this is going to take a few minutes. To start with, we're going to go here to the European Science Media Hub. This is the European Parliamentary Research Service. And this article is titled "The Differences Between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2." The most important thing here, especially when we get into talking about the masks, studies that suggest possible aerosol transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Although according to the World Health Organization, SARS-CoV-2 can only be transmitted by contaminated surfaces or via droplets that fall within 1 meter, some cases also suggest the possibility of aerosol transmission in small enclosed environments. A new study on the aerosol and surface stability of SARS-CoV-2 compared to SARS-CoV-1 that was published by the New England Journal of Medicine reveals that SARS-CoV-2 can stay suspended in the air for 3 hours, with a similar reduction in its infectious rate as that of SARS-CoV-1, and that properties of SARS-CoV-2 are very similar to those of SARS-CoV-1 in terms of its formation and stability of air particles. However, the affinity to human receptors of SARS-CoV-2 is 10 times higher than that of SARS-CoV-1. Another study carried out in China estimates that 86% of all infections were undocumented. And that's really important because, we don't have any clue as to how many undocumented cases there are because they suppress every single study. But if you use these numbers, that means that there is 8 times the amount of cases that have been reported. So if we're close to 5 million, that means that close to 40 million people have probably been infected with this virus already, which is important when we get to comparing it with the flu numbers. I kind of explained a little bit of that in my last video, I think. This would help explain the rapid spread of the virus and also raises awareness on just how difficult it is to contain. Virologist and coronavirus specialist Dr. Wathalet says that more than 3,000 medical staff were infected in China due to the absence of proper N95 or FFP2 masks, highlighting that while the surgical masks they were using instead protect against droplets, they do not provide sufficient protection against microdroplets. Another study carried out in order to determine possible modes of virus transmission investigated a cluster of SARS-CoV-2 cases associated with a shopping mall in China. The study found that indirect transmission of the virus occurred, likely resulting via contaminated objects or via virus aerosolization or by asymptomatic infected persons. It also suggests that SARS-CoV-2 might also spread through the airborne route and remain infectious for up to 1 hour after aerosolization. Another important consideration is that SARS coronaviruses could possibly evolve a greater ability to evade the host immune response, according to his study identifying such mutants exhibiting this ability. Virologist and coronavirus specialist Mark Wathalet says that the evolution of the virus can most effectively be addressed by hydroxychloroquine, as it detects the host. It targets the host cell rather than the virus itself, making it difficult for the virus to escape it. He also calls attention to the most important difference of SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, which is that, as opposed to SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2 transmits also as an aerosol. Taking this into consideration, the question arises as to why the WHO has not yet updated its recommendations accordingly. The needed studies are hard to do and require significant planning, and I myself have submitted multiple proposals to fund work to try to answer this question, says Professor Milton, affiliate in cell biology and molecular genetics of the University of Maryland School of Medicine. But given there are now several reports of the presence of SARS-CoV-2 in respirable aerosols and on exhaust vents, indicating potential airborne infection risk, the precautionary principle mandates that we consider that risk as real and take all possible steps to limit that risk. Another factor that might contribute to the WHO's current recommendation in terms of SARS-CoV-2's transmissibility is the ability to provide healthcare workers with protection from airborne infection transmission via aerosols is very limited. It is especially so in low and middle income countries, but many wealthy countries are not prepared either and are confronting extreme shortages. I think that there is a lot of fear about consequences if workers are told they cannot be assured of effective engineering controls and proper personal protective equipment. Here's a little bit more of what Professor Mark Wathele, molecular biologist, coronavirus specialist, has to say about the aerosols. The question is, taking the precautionary principle in medicine into consideration, in your opinion, why does the WHO insist on its statement regarding the transmission competence of SARS-CoV-2? Do you envisage a different international governmental approach soon? And he responds, I think that the WHO position articulated on 27 March 2020, saying that aerosol transmission is not possible, is driven by two things. First, epidemiology is not capable of distinguishing among contact, droplet, and airborne transmission, and there is a strong bias in the medical infectious disease professions towards acknowledging only those transmission pathways wherein the agent can be easily detected in the vehicle of transmission. It is relatively easy to detect an infectious agent on surfaces in a large droplet spray. The aerobiological pathway is elusive. It is very hard to detect even Mycobacterium tuberculosis in the air, even though we know that it is transmitted by exhaled aerosols. Well, the WHO did admit in its report after the fact-finding mission in China that aerosol transmission was a possibility requiring further studies, but indeed it has not updated its recommendations to include how to prevent this type of transmission. It seems that we must reevaluate our international approach of fighting global infectious diseases because our current approach has been slow and ineffective. Here the question is, can immunity to SARS-CoV-2 be developed after being infected by it, and can it mutate to an extent that it becomes resistant to the vaccination that is currently being developed? Also, do you think that chloroquine therapy could be an effective possible way of treatment for SARS-CoV-2? Some form of immunity is developed in people who have been infected by the new coronavirus with the production of detectable antibodies. This is important in order to track transmission of the infection through the population and better understand its dynamics. However, it is not a given that this immunity will be robust. If we use other already known coronaviruses as a guide, the immunity naturally developed in individuals may not be strong enough to provide collective immunity. It will provide maintained immunity to changes in SARS-CoV-2 brought about by the genetic and antigenic drift. Induced immunity through vaccination is also not a given. Some previous coronavirus vaccines in animals protect against the disease while others exacerbate it. And so the testing of vaccines is very important. Chloroquine therapy is very promising, although early results are still to be confirmed by several studies currently being conducted. Hydroxychloroquine is the most active form as it targets the host cell rather than the viral component. As it is the host cell being targeted, it is much more difficult for the virus to mutate resistance to the therapy. So here you have China saying that this thing is transmitted by aerosolization, and they had 3,000 medical staff infected, but the WHO didn't confirm that. The WHO is saying that it doesn't spread that way. And basically, the doctor says that the reason why this is because they don't want to scare healthcare workers. Again, getting back to the fact of the matter is that this virus is highly contagious. They can't do anything to stop the spread. Masks don't work. You have to practically wear a hazmat suit to be able to stop the spread. So they just tell everyone to wear the mask and everything to make them feel better. Okay, also if you go over here to the CDC page on SARS-CoV-1, that's the one from 2003, check out how it spreads. The main way that SARS seems to spread is by close person-to-person contact. The virus that causes SARS is thought to be transmitted most readily by respiratory droplets, produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes. Droplet spread can happen when droplets from the cough or sneeze of an infected person are propelled a short distance, generally up to 3 feet, through the air and deposited on the mucous membranes of the mouth, nose, or eyes of persons who are nearby. The virus also can spread when a person touches a surface or object contaminated with infectious droplets and then touches his or her mouth, nose, or eyes. In addition, it is possible that the SARS virus might spread more broadly through the air or by other ways that are not now known. Okay, now, if you look at that, the guidelines make a lot of sense. The 6 foot social distancing, the wearing the masks so that you don't breathe droplets onto people. This is the sort of thing that you would have done for SARS-CoV-1. However, it is useless basically to do this for SARS-CoV-2 because it can be transmitted as an aerosol through the air, like I had mentioned, and it's 10 times as contagious. So you're 10 times as vulnerable if you come into contact with it. Okay, now here is a study on the CDC's website where they tested 2 types of surgical masks against aerosols. Now, one surgical mask was about 20% effective, and then the other one was around 50% or so effective. It really doesn't matter. The conclusion is right here. Neither surgical mask can effectively remove submicrometer-sized aerosol particles such as aerosolized bloodborne pathogens. Translation: masks are pointless. So, I mean, there is your proof. You know, it's an aerosol. The masks can't do anything about that. If you're wearing a mask and you breathe into the mask, then the virus goes right through it. It doesn't matter if you're spitting or hawking a loogie or whatever, like it goes right through the mask. Another thing I just wanted to touch on for a second, a lot of people, if you'll do a Google search on asymptomatic spread, there is a plethora of articles saying that if you're asymptomatic, you spread the virus, and all of those articles, every single one of them, were written in the last 2 months, and that is because the World Health Organization came out and basically said that it's very rare. Right here it says, top World Health Organization official clarified on Tuesday that scientists have not determined yet how frequently people with asymptomatic cases of COVID-19 pass the disease on to others, a day after suggesting that such spread is very rare. Okay, they came out and said it's rare if you're asymptomatic for it to spread, and then they immediately had to walk that back because that completely goes against this narrative of social distancing and everything else if you're fine, if you're healthy. So they had to immediately walk that back because then it completely makes everything that we're doing as healthy individuals pointless. And as soon as that happened, 1 million articles were written. And by the way, if you search for those articles and you read them, there is no evidence. There's no evidence. There is 5,000 articles written that, you know, they think that asymptomatic, or, you know, it appears, or it, you know, they'll mention these different situations where they think that asymptomatic people spread the virus, but it's all correlation. They have no proof whatsoever. And because the tests are so inaccurate and the incubation time of this virus, it is practically impossible to tell where you got the virus. So every time, it is like mere speculation that you spread it when you're asymptomatic. There is absolutely zero evidence to date of that, despite the fact that there's 1,000 articles saying so. Okay, now I want to touch on this article real quick. This talks a little bit about Fauci and hydroxychloroquine and the paper that came out back in 2005, which I covered in my other video, I think. This is True Pundit, but they cover most of this stuff is cited in other sources. So it says, cover up. Fauci approved hydroxychloroquine 15 years ago to cure coronaviruses. Nobody needed to die. Now, as it said in the other article, because of the similarities between the old SARS virus and this SARS virus, hydroxychloroquine is still a very viable treatment. Okay, just like that paper that came out about the original SARS virus in 2003, and how the paper was written in 2005 about how hydroxychloroquine was so effective. Okay, here, Dr. Anthony Fauci, whose expert advice to President Trump has resulted in the complete shutdown of the greatest economic engine in world history, has known since 2005 that chloroquine is an effective inhibitor of coronaviruses. How did he know this? Because of research done by the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, of which he is the director. In connection with the SARS outbreak caused by a coronavirus dubbed SARS-CoV, The NIH researched chloroquine and concluded that it was effective at stopping the SARS coronavirus in its tracks. The COVID-19 bug is likewise a coronavirus labeled SARS-CoV-2. While not exactly the same as SARS-CoV-1, it is genetically related to it and shares 79% of its genome. As the name SARS-CoV-2 implies, they both use the same host cell receptor, which is what viruses use to gain entry into the cell and infect the victim. The Virology Journal, the official publication of Dr. Fauci's National Institutes of Health, published that what is now a blockbuster article on August 22, 2005, under the heading, "Get ready for this, chloroquine is a potential inhibitor of SARS coronavirus infection and spread." Write the researchers, "We report that chloroquine has strong antiviral effects on SARS-CoV infection of primate cells. These inhibitory effects are observed when the cells are treated with the drug either before or after exposure to the virus, suggesting both prophylactic and therapeutic advantage." This is the study that was the basis for everyone trying hydroxychloroquine to combat this virus in the very beginning. This means, of course, that Dr. Fauci has known for 15 years that chloroquine and its even milder derivative hydroxychloroquine will not only treat a current case of coronavirus, but prevent future cases. So hydroxychloroquine functions as both a cure and a vaccine. In other words, it's a wonder drug for coronavirus, said Dr. Fauci's NIH in 2005. Concentrations of 10 micromoles completely abolish SARS-CoV infection. Fauci's researchers add, chloroquine can effectively reduce the establishment of infection and spread of SARS-CoV. I think that's micromoles. I'm not entirely sure. Dr. Didier Raoult, the Anthony Fauci of France, had such spectacular success using hydroxychloroquine to treat victims of SARS-CoV-2 that he said way back on February 25th that it's game over for coronavirus. He and a team of researchers reported that the use of hydroxychloroquine administered with both azithromycin and zinc cured 79 of 80 patients with only rare and minor adverse events. In conclusion, these researchers write, "We confirm the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine associated with azithromycin in the treatment of COVID-19 and its potential effectiveness in the early impairment of contagiousness." The highly publicized VA study that purported to show hydroxychloroquine was ineffective showed nothing of the sort. Hydroxychloroquine wasn't administered until the patients were virtually on their deathbeds, when research indicates it should be prescribed as soon as symptoms are apparent. Plus, hydroxychloroquine was administered without azithromycin and zinc, which form the cocktail that makes it supremely effective. At-risk individuals need to receive the hydroxychloroquine cocktail at the first sign of symptoms. Need to receive it. But Governor Andrew Cuomo banned the use of hydroxychloroquine in the entire state of New York on March 6th. The Democrat governors of Nevada and Michigan soon followed suit, and by March 28th, the whole country was under incarceration and placed FOTWAs. Nothing happened with regard to the use of hydroxychloroquine in the U.S. until March 20, when President Trump put his foot down and insisted that the FDA consider authorizing hydroxychloroquine for off-label use to treat SARS-CoV-2. On March 23rd, Dr. Vladimir Zelenko reported that he had treated around 500 coronavirus patients with hydroxychloroquine and had seen an astonishing 100% success rate. That's not the anecdotal evidence Dr. Fauci sneers at, but actual results with real patients in clinical settings. Since last Thursday, my team has treated approximately 350 patients in Curious Joel and another 150 patients in other areas of New York with the above regimen. Of this group and the information provided to me by affiliated medical teams, we have had 0 deaths, 0 hospitalizations, and 0 intubations. In addition, I have not heard any negative side effects other than approximately 10% of patients with temporary nausea and diarrhea, which is also symptoms of the disease, actually. And that was Dr. Zelenko. If you scale this nationally, the economy will rebound much quicker. The country will open again, and let me tell you a very important point. This treatment costs about $20. That's very important because you can scale that nationally. If every treatment costs $20,000, that's not so good. All I'm doing is repurposing old viable drugs, which we know their safety profiles, and using them in a unique combination in an outpatient setting. The questions are disturbing to a spectacular degree. If Dr. Fauci has known since 2005 of the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine, why hasn't it been administered immediately after people show symptoms, as Dr. Zelenko has done? Maybe then nobody would have died and nobody would have been incarcerated in place except the sick, which is who a quarantine is for in the first place. To paraphrase Jesus, it's not the symptom-free who need hydroxychloroquine, but the sick, and they need it at the first sign of symptoms. While the regressive healthcare establishment wants the hydroxychloroquine cocktail to only be administered late in the course of the infection, from a medical standpoint, this is stupid, said one doctor. As a physician, this baffles me. I can't think of a single infectious condition, bacterial, fungal, or viral, where the best medical treatment is to delay the use of an antibacterial, antifungal, or antiviral until the infection is far advanced. And now what they're talking about is the state mandates. A lot of the states completely banned the treatment of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19, but then a lot of the few that allowed it said that they couldn't prescribe it unless they were already hospitalized and were far along, well, already hospitalized, I guess. By the time they already get hospitalized and everything, they're really far along. They need to do it in an outpatient setting, like he said before, as soon as the symptoms start. So why has Dr. Fauci minimized and dismissed hydroxychloroquine at every turn instead of pushing this thing from Jump Street? He didn't even launch clinical trials of hydroxychloroquine until April 9th, by which time 33,000 people had died. This may be why. Chloroquine, a relatively safe, effective, and cheap drug used for treating many human diseases, is effective in inhibiting the infection and spread of SARS-CoV. That's the problem. It is safe, inexpensive, and it works. In other words, there's nothing sexy or avant-garde about hydroxychloroquine. It's been around since 1934. Given human nature, it's possible, even likely, that those who are chasing the unicorn of a coronavirus vaccine are doing so for reasons other than human health. I can't see into anybody's heart and can't presume to know their motives, but on the other hand, human nature recognizes that there's no glory in pushing hydroxychloroquine, and nobody is going to get anything named for him in the history books. The polio vaccine was developed by Jonas Salk in 1954, and it is still known as the Salk vaccine. There will be no Fauci vaccine if hydroxychloroquine is the answer to the problem. So while Dr. Fauci is tut-tutting and poo-pooing hydroxychloroquine, Dr. Raoult and Dr. Zelensky are out there saving lives at $20 a pop. Maybe we should spend more time listening to them than the wizards of smart bureaucrats the talking snake media fawns over. Dr. Fauci is regarded by the talking snake media as the oracle at Delphi. The entire nation hangs on his every word, but if nobody is dying and nobody is locked down, his 15 minutes of fame fades to zero. Very few people are not going to be influenced by that prospect, especially when it's easy to keep the attention of the public by continuing to feed the panic. There is a monstrous reputational risk for those who will be found to have dismissively waved off a treatment that could have been used from the very beginning. Even back on February 15th, when Dr. Fauci said that the risk from the coronavirus was minuscule, how many lives could have been saved if the heads of our multi-billion-dollar healthcare bureaucracy had been advocating for hydroxychloroquine treatment from day one? We'll never know. Instead, their advice has been dangerous and deadly in every sense of that word. Someday, maybe even today, we will be able to identify the individuals who had the knowledge and expertise to make a global difference, but turned up their noses at the solution when it could have made all the difference in the world. Okay, another thing I wanted to cover was the testing. There's three kinds of tests. There's the PCR test, the antigen test, and an antibody test. The antibody test is pretty straightforward. They test for antibodies present in the blood. So after you've been infected, those antibodies will be present in your blood. I think up to 30 days. I can't remember. It's not that long actually. But here is some details on the PCR test. There's a lot of hands-on work involved in performing RT-PCR tests. First, a technician extracts a viral genetic material called RNA. If it is present from the sample and uses it to produce a complementary strand of DNA that the RT-PCR technique amplifies or makes thousands of copies of to get a measurable result. The primary difference from one kit to another is which coronavirus genes each test targets. CDC-approved kits target regions on a gene that codes for the protein that makes the virus's nucleocapsid, an envelope that houses its RNA. The biotechnology companies Roche Diagnostics, LabCorp, and Thermo Fisher Scientific are among the top suppliers. Okay, basically the PCR test tests for viral material, the RNA. Something to note about that is you don't necessarily have to be infected to test positive on this because it's testing for viral material, not necessarily the virus. The other type of test is the antigen test. To understand antigen testing, you have to know what an antigen is. An antigen is a substance recognized by the body's immune system, which can then respond by generating proteins called antibodies that specifically recognize that antigen. Albert Shaw, a Yale medicine infectious disease doctor and professor of medicine at Yale School of Medicine, explains it health. The point of an antigen test is to detect the presence of a protein, the nucleocapsid protein, which is part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that is the cause of the cause of COVID-19. In that sense, and per FDA's statement, an antigen test basically looks for those fragments of antigens within a person's body to see if they're infected with the virus. Okay, I just wanted to explain those types of tests real quick, but this is another thing to keep in mind right here. CDC coronavirus test kits generate 30% false positive and 20% false negative results. I've actually seen this. It's more like an average of 30% false negative or more. I cover that in my second video, I think. But it's 20% only around day 8. But something to keep in mind is about 30% are false positive and 30% are false negative. Well, if it's a false positive, how do they know that? And also, does that mean you could subtract 30% of the cases that are being reported? I don't know. But it's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that, these hospitals and stuff get extra money for positive COVID cases. So if they're getting 30% false positives, they're not going to care because they're going to be able to get that money. Another thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that in the very beginning when all this started, they eliminated all liability for COVID cases. And I think that's something really important to know. I'm really curious to see, usually it's 250,000 people a year die from medical malpractice. Now, I'm curious to see what that number is going to be this year because all a hospital has to do, or a nursing home or anybody, is have a COVID positive case. And if that person dies from anything, then they're completely free of being sued for malpractice. And something along those lines just happened to someone my dad knows, or my uncle, my uncle knows a guy that had to get shoulder surgery here in town. So his daughter brought him to the hospital, and I know this is anecdotal, but it's a good example. Supposedly they both caught COVID in the hospital. Unfortunately, I don't know the timeline of all this because you can't even test positive for COVID unless it's been in your system for like 4 to 5 days minimum. So they both caught it. He had his surgery, and then shortly after his surgery, he had a stroke and died. Now, commonly, if someone dies right after a surgery, it's very common that it could be from an allergic reaction to the anesthetic. It could be caused from other complications that they didn't know that the patient had. People do not die of a stroke from COVID. Not only that, but it takes like a good couple weeks or so for COVID to make your lungs so bad to where you die from it. So I find it very strange that he died of COVID, even though he had a stroke right after his surgery, and they both supposedly caught COVID when they got to the hospital. So I don't know, it just sounds really strange. But something to keep in mind is that they'll never be able to sue for malpractice for him dying, even though it was just a shoulder surgery, because he tested positive for COVID. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind because there is a lot of lawsuits every single year dealing with malpractice, and that's like a get out of jail free card for malpractice lawsuits. Okay, another thing I want to cover is how I think this virus is seasonal. I covered this article in one of my previous videos where they did this study back in April. There's 7 coronaviruses known to affect humans, and these guys focused on the 4 that cause severe respiratory infections. All 4 of those were found to be highly seasonal. While the findings don't have direct bearing on whether or not the SARS-CoV-2 is likewise affected by the changing of the seasons, the investigators say they hope their study will provide valuable context. They go on to say here in the study, the regular appearance of all types of coronaviruses in the same months with minimal circulation in the summer was a clear finding of this study. Oh, and it said back here that the peak months are in January and February. Right here, combined over the 8 years, the number of identifications for each virus increased in December, peaked in January or February, and began to decrease in March. Now, that's going to be in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, it'll be July and August. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the data that I analyze here. This is what the per capita death rate for the United States looks like over the course of the year. You'll see that we have a big spike here. This about follows the flu season, or the season. The virus was introduced into our population kind of late, which is why it spiked up kind of late. You know, normally the spike would would really be off the chart here. But this follows the season, and then we have this supposed second wave here. And the reason why I'm drawing attention to this is because I think this second wave is completely fabricated, and I've got a lot of evidence to back it up. Now, if we go down here, these are all the states that appear to follow a season with the coronavirus. They're all listed right here. I don't even know how many that is, but it's like at least half the states very obviously follow the seasonal trend. And this is actually the United States, all the way down here at the bottom. So you can see how some of these states are just way over the average per capita. This is per capita of all the different states, and this is the per capita of the United States, this blue line way down here. Obviously, this green one that goes off the chart, that's New York City. But all of these states follow the seasonal trend. And down here, we have this. I know this looks kind of messy, but this is later in the year. This is starting at June 13th. If you look, let's see, I think it's right here. This blue line right here is the little bump, the little second wave bump of the United States. And so these are all the states that really contributed to this second wave that we're having. Of course, the top one being Arizona that goes off the chart here. And I listed the states right here that are really significant for this second wave. Arizona, Mississippi, Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana. Something's going on in Louisiana. Nevada, California, even Maryland, Arkansas and Rhode Island, I think, are some small contributors to that. But basically, my point is that if this is seasonal, all of these states are committing massive fraud. And now the thing is it can only be one or the other. It can either be seasonal or not seasonal. So if it's not seasonal, then it makes no sense that all of these countries and all of these states appear to follow the seasonal trend. And these are all countries that follow the seasonal trend. You'll notice it's pretty much the vast majority of Europe and Canada. And I'll get to the WHO map here in a second to show you that. But here you have Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, France, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, Austria, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Japan. Those are all the Northern Hemisphere countries that, well, at least the ones that I picked out, the main ones, that show a seasonal trend. And even in the Southern Hemisphere looks a lot different, mainly because you have Africa, which doesn't have very many cases, and there's a lot of really weird stuff. I'll get to the WHO map in a second, but Argentina, Bolivia, and South Africa show very obvious seasonal trends. Now here's the WHO map, or the WHO map. And you'll see here, this is what a seasonal trend looks like. This is Argentina. Now remember, July and August is going to be like January, February. This follows a seasonal trend for the Southern Hemisphere. South Africa follows a seasonal trend. And we'll go back up to Canada and Europe just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Let's see here. Look at Italy. This is what a seasonal trend looks like. Okay, and so it's like either all these people that have trends like this are lying, or all the other people are lying. And pretty much all of Europe looks like this, seasonal trend. And you can tell by these, the WHO is not very good at reporting their numbers. You know, the reason why there's such huge spikes is because, you know, they don't report all their deaths like when they're supposed to. You know, like these people could have died earlier, but they just reported them on that day. But this is an obvious seasonal trend. You look at Britain, seasonal trend. Sweden is very obviously seasonal. Well, maybe not as obvious, but that's definitely seasonal. And look at Canada. Anyways, all those countries that I listed look like this. And then if you go to a country like Brazil, I don't know what's going on in Brazil. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, I've been reading there's some crazy stuff going on there, but if you look at Brazil, it's just straight across the board. Like, this makes no sense at all. There's something going on down there. So it can only be one or the other. You can't have both. Either it's one or the other. And again, if you look at the United States, it follows a seasonal trend until you get like right into here. Something weird's going on in here. And that's just kind of the point that I wanted to make there. And the reason why that's important is because if it is seasonal, then they need to redo how they do the death numbers. We should be entering in another season. And if this is anything like the SARS virus, like the president keeps saying it'll go away, if it's anything like the previous SARS virus, that is actually what will happen. It'll eventually go away, just like the last one did. It's not a if it's like the last one, it's not going to be a recurring seasonal virus. It'll just, once we get herd immunity or it passes through the population, it'll literally fall off the map. Unless there happens to be some weird outbreak someday somewhere. But getting back to the estimated cases, if you look at the flu, let's see, where is it? Right here. You know, these are the flu estimates. You know, the flu death rate is based on, you know, this says 40 to 60,000 for this year, 30 to 45,000 this year. These are all estimated. Even the deaths are estimated. You know, they have these ranges of estimated deaths. And so they estimate that 45 million people got the flu because the vast majority of people who have the flu don't get hospitalized, or, you know, they might go get some cold medicine or something. And then you'll have people that die of pneumonia and the flu and things like that. But the vast majority are not tested. And so these are estimated. And if you go back to like that China study, that would mean that, you know, 40 million or so in our population have had this virus. And then if you use that number with the current deaths, which in my opinion, this is the best website. This is the only site that actually verifies death certificates. That Worldometer site and even the WHO site are not very good because they're not confirmed. But these are at least confirmed on death certificates. So right now it's being reported that 144,000. I mean, if you figure there's, let's just say 40 million people that have been infected, that's going to be what? That is a 0.3% death per case death rate, which is very comparable to the flu. And they do not want to tell you that, but I mean, I don't know how much more evidence you need. So I think that about covers everything that I wanted to show in this video. So just to give a synopsis of what we covered in this video, masks are completely useless. The coronavirus, because the coronavirus is spread through aerosolization, we learned about the testing and how inaccurate it is, and how those work, the PCR and the antigen tests and the antibody tests. And we learned how almost all the states and countries in the northern hemisphere follow a seasonal pattern. And we also learned that hydroxychloroquine, once again, is what we should be using to treat this virus. So thanks for sticking around. I hope you learned something, and we'll see you again next time.